Good morning, boys and girls. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to find out what happens next in our story, The Endless Step. We left off on chapter 16. We're just getting started to finding out how Esther and her mother survived this winter in Siberia. While I'm reading, I want you to think about her character and how much she has persevered and endured in just these past 2 years that she's been in Siberia. And I also want you to think about the text. As I read, think about the different text features that the author used to help you determine the important information you're reading. So what that means is, think of the different text features. There weren't pictures, or they're not pictures. You're going to have to really listen to the emphasis and voice, and think about how the author, how she wrote about her story to make it real to you, and what was important about that chapter. That's what I really want you to focus on. What did you get from this chapter? What have you learned about Esther and life in Siberia during World War II? All right, so here we go. That winter, cold settled in the bones as if it would be stored there indefinitely, like ice in an ice house. The hut was perpetually cold. I ripped the red sweater with ice-cold fingers and a cold heart. And when it was too cold to stay out of bed, I knitted in bed. Wearing socks, old socks of father's, had replaced my outgrown ones. My sweater and often a shawl over my head. I tried wearing gloves, but that didn't work. In the early morning, when it was still dark, the moment of leaving the cold hut for the walk to school was always a moment of trauma. The walk would take well over an hour, and it wasn't a walk at all. It was a constant battle with the ferociously buffeting and icy wind. The battle might have been lost if I had not gone in convoy. Now, a convoy is where a bunch of people line up, or you might have heard it used when you're on the highway and you can see trucks, the great big semi trucks, they're all together, one in front of the other. Well, that's called a convoy. So what she's telling us here is that they would do a convoy of students to get to school safely. It says, the convoy consisted of about 6 children, excuse me, who picked one another up on the way and used one another as windbreaks. Holding onto our books with one arm, we grabbed one another around the waist with the free arm and hid behind another's back. So for once, no one wanted to be the leader, and we had to take turns being first in line. On the way, we would meet other little bands of children linked together in the same manner. Everyone who could went to school this way in the Siberian winter. No one was ever excluded. Everyone was needed. In this instance, if there was a most popular person, it would be the biggest and the fattest at this point. There was one place where I forgot the cold. Indeed, forgot all about Siberia. And that was in the library. There, in that muddy village, was a great institution. Not physically, to be sure, but in every other way imaginable. It was a small log cabin, immaculately attended to, with loving care. It was well lighted with oil lamps, and it was warm. But best of all, it contained a small but amazing collection from the world's best literature. Truly amazing considering the time and the place and for its size. From floor to ceiling, it was lined with books. Books. Books! It was there that I was to become acquainted with the works of Dumas, Pasternak, translations of Shakespeare, the novels of Mark Twain, Jack London, and of course, the Russians. It was in that log cabin that I escaped from my Siberia. I was either reading there or taking the books home. It was between that library and two extraordinary teachers that I developed a lifelong passion for the great Russian novelists and poets. And it was there that I learned to line up patiently for my turn to sit at a table and read, to wait sometimes months for a book that I so desperately wanted. It was there that I learned that reading was not only a great delight, but a privilege. Cold or no cold, fearing that I might still be running a race with the cow, I finally finished the red sweater and promptly got myself another customer. This time it was a lady who had come from Moscow with her daughter and some wool. Lovely, fluffy, soft, unused wool. The lady ordered 2 sweaters and agreed to pay me with a chifforobe. A what? Mother wanted to know. A chifforobe, Mama. It's just beautiful. And just what would we need it for, I suppose. Now, a chifforobe is just another word for an armoire or a closet. Now, remember, the closets we have today are built into our walls. But the closets back in the early 1900s, they didn't have them like we do. They were great big pieces of furniture with 2 doors that you opened up and that had a place to hang a few things and some drawers. So that's what she was going to be paid for in return for making these sweaters. I seemed to need it. I loved it. It was made of plywood and it had been stained brown. It had a cupboard on top with 2 drawers below. We had some difficulty fitting it into the hut. Its front rested on the logs covering the hole so that it stood somewhat tilted. And there wasn't too much that we owned to even put in it. In fact, it was rather pathetically empty. But I thought it was beautiful and that I had been paid very well. One night, the hut got too cold for Mother. In the country of permafrost, sub-zero temperatures, and snow as deep as a hut is high, a glass of water turned to ice should have been of no consequence, but it was. Every night, Mother set a glass of water next to her bed. The night that she awakened with the thirst to find that the water had turned to ice, that was the last straw. Now think about that. She put a glass of water next to her bed so that when she got thirsty in the night, she could take a drink. But when she woke up, it was so cold in that hut that the water had frozen solid. That had to be pretty cold. I don't know how they stayed alive. She was certain we all would freeze to death in that hut, and she decided to enlist, or ask, Uncle Yoza's help in finding a new house. Well, Uncle Yoza and Aunt Zaya had become more and more important, not just to me, but to Mother too. Indeed, there were ways in which she needed them even more than I did. I had school and homework and school friends to remind me that I was still a member of the human race, but not so Mother. If it had not been for a few Polish families, and most particularly Uncle Yoza and Aunt Zaya, I think it more than likely that Mother would have cracked up. Good talk was her beauty treatment. The life would come back to her, bringing with it her old beauty. She and Uncle Yoza and Aunt Zaya talked about everything in the warmth and coziness of their living room. Cozy, that is, by Siberian standards, were a decent fire, 1 rug, and possibly 1 or 2 overstuffed chairs gave us the illusion of opulence. Do you remember that word, opulence? That means fancy or wealthy. So what we would consider as very basic right now, they, being in Siberia, when they saw 2 stuffed chairs and a rug and a fire, they felt wealthy or fancy. They talked about Turneve, a great favorite of mother's, and Solom Ekliom, which is another, um, not artist, but it's another author. I'm sorry. They talked about music. They compared notes about the things they had seen and done, but they did not talk about politics or about any aspect of the Soviet life that derived from its social system. They talked as if they were in a cafe in Vilna or Paris or even London, as if the next day were not certain to bring some confrontation with sickness or starvation or death, or even all three. And usually there was some rationed tea, some precious tidbit, such as a piece of smoked redfish, to add to the pleasure. Thanks to Uncle Yose's concern, we were offered the possibility of a few months' respite from cold and hunger. In other words, a sojourn in heaven. One of the directors of the tractor factory, Yosef Isayevich, would give us food, in addition to our own rations, and lodging in exchange for caring for him and his house while his wife and children were away. His house was warm and clean, and there would even be eggs to eat. But the but was a staggering one and stuck in Uncle Yose's throat. There would be no room for grandmother. Mother and I were adamant. It was out of the question for us to be separated. Grandmother was equally adamant. It was stupid for three people to freeze to death, particularly when two of them could invite the third one to warm her bones at the fire and share their food. Besides, we can use a little holiday from each other. That was true. They were human, and the long, close confinement under dreadful conditions had been a strain on both grandmother and mother. It could not have been otherwise. But to me in Siberia, togetherness was everything, and I felt not only guilty, but betrayal. The Koftols had found a hut for themselves, quite as miserable as ours, and grandmother was to sleep there. Taking grandmother and her little bundles to the Koftols made me feel sick. We shouldn't have let her go, I said to mother. Stop it, mother said sharply. I don't need you to make me feel any worse than I do. Yosef's house was next to the tractor factory, and when we moved, my precious chifforobe came along too, and very useful it was, since it served to divide our sleeping quarters from Yosef's in his two-room, which was just a bedroom and a kitchen, house. Yosef was a genial man who shared his food generously, kept his wooden house warm, and treated mother with great respect. So much so that when he was not able to walk right, which was often, his chief concern was to keep it a secret from mother. Please, he said to me once he came home drunk, and that's what they meant by not able to walk right. In the afternoon, I beg of you, do not let your mother know. Such a fine lady. Not letting mother know must have given him a much bruised shin. A bruised shin is an idiom for being, it hurt his pride. When he thought he would be asleep, it meant that he would come home late when he thought we would be asleep. And we would lie there, listen to him bump about in the dark, and hope that he wouldn't break a leg. It was a ludicrous game of pretend. We didn't know. Whatever we did for him, we did because we wanted to, not because he demanded it. We cooked and we cleaned, and I learned how to iron a man's shirt. I ironed on a blanket covered a board, which was placed across the backs of two chairs. Ooh, she's such a good thinker. When she has to improvise or make do with what she has. So she created an ironing board out of two chairs and a piece of wood that laid across the top of them. She's very resourceful is the word I was really looking for. I used an iron filled with hot coals, blowing on them to keep them burning. Joseph's house was wired for electricity, but as we stared up into an empty socket, we were constantly reminded of the scarcity of light bulbs. However, there was a loudspeaker in the kitchen, and the government sponsored broadcast brought us news about the outside world and music, opera, folk songs, and dance. Sitting in Joseph's warm kitchen, listening to music, Mother and I would be filled with wonder at our good fortune. Grandmother did come to eat with us, and that winter all three of us got a little fatter. All right, so that's the end of chapter 16. That is awesome. Now, Joseph, as you know, was a friend of Uncle Zaya, or, what was his name? Of Aunt Zaya's. And so they helped them find this gentleman whose wife and children had went somewhere for a while, and he needed someone to come in and take care of the home and cook and clean for him. So they were offered that. So think about that, going from a mud hut made of dung. Remember, the dung was animal poo and dirt mixed together. They went from that kind of a home to a real wooden home that had 2 rooms, just a kitchen and a bedroom. So they were able to separate the bedroom with her chifforobe and make 2 separate sleeping quarters, but they were warm. They had 2 comfortable chairs that they have never had to sit in since they've gotten to Siberia. They had food available to them, and they invited grandmother over. Now, grandmother was smart because she knew as long as those 2 were in that place, that grandmother could come over and spend the day, could eat, relax, stay warm, and all she had to do was go back to the coftals to sleep. So it was a good situation for all 3 of them. And I wonder how long that will last. I hope you enjoyed that chapter, and I want you to think, predict, because we've went into, wow, how many chapters have we read? 17 out of 23. And we've watched Esther go from being 10 years old to 12, almost 13 at this time, and what she has endured those 2 winters. The most striking thing for me in that chapter, remember my question before we started reading, was what did the author use in text features to help get the information across, or something that stuck with you? I want you to think about that. What was the most interesting thing or important thing to you about this particular chapter? What was it that Esther and her mother were able to accomplish that really made you feel, I am so glad they're there? So I want you to predict what's going to be happening next. Now, I was thinking about the chapter that we just read also, and I thought how neat it was when I went back to look how she felt about the library. It was just like a piece of heaven to her. And it was so important to her to get to sit in the library and read because it was warm. There were books everywhere, and she loved books. Now remember, why did she love books? Why do you like books? I bet they're for the same reason. Even though you live here in the United States, in Indiana, her reasoning might be slightly different because she's in Siberia. What is it about the books that she loves so much that she would stand in line for hours just to be able to get a seat at a table to read, or wait months for a particular book she'd heard about and wanted to read? So think about that. So when we get together and meet again, I want you to message me on a Google Docs and tell me what you thought about that chapter. It doesn't have to be long, but I do want it to have some substance. I want you to really think about what was read and what you are learning about Esther in this particular chapter, or what you thought was interesting, or how you would react in that situation, or how you have a connection with her. Okay, until our next chapter. See you later.